The 70s was a very significant time for black musicians because a lot of things had been wrestled with, you know, and kind of settled in everybody's mind by that time about having the courage to just go straight ahead with what your energy is about and go for it. I won't take you higher, higher, I won't take you
To me, Sly was an intellectual version of James Brown and Motown. I mean, how in the hell can anybody get soul music to be that tight until it's pop and still have as much soul as the old-fashioned blues singers? He's by far one of the most brilliant songwriters there ever was.
He was a genius. To be able to conceive of all different types of music and to fuse it into one thing and to set new standards at that time, because prior to Sly, black musicians didn't sell a lot of albums. Mostly sold single records. So when Sly came along, it kind of broke that chain.
There was a concert I went to, I never forget, I went to a Sly and the Family Stone concert. The whole place was rocking, stupidly rocking. And I always wanted to have my concert be like that. I said, God, I'll know I will have really made it to the top when my concerts do that.
On the wall, very superstition, let us not fall.
Stevie Wonder, little TV. We've watched Stevie grow up, even before we got to Motown. He was so frisky when he was little, and you know, he used to always jump when he was performing, you know, doing like that. We used to say, okay, Stevie, keep it up. So you better get somewhere and sit your little butt down, okay? You know, I ain't gonna do it, I ain't gonna do it. Stevie jumped one time, jumped right off the stage. Okay. Then we tell you to get somewhere and sit down.
Supposed to shut it away. Yeah. Wash up and said, hey.
The interesting thing about Stevie Wonder is he broke away from the Motown mold. He matured to the point where he said to Berry Gordy, I got to do what I do. I want to create my kind of music.
Keep me a daydream.
Stevie Wonder, going back to Talking Book, he was playing all the instruments himself and playing synthesizer. It was great.
You don't want to shake me, sad in the song.
Well, Stevie was recording like 150 to 200 songs during this period, and he did 4 of the greatest albums I think he ever did in his life, you know, Innovisions and all those great things, and he just fell in. And I remember there's these 2 synthesizer players, Bob Markleff and a friend of his, and they had this huge, monstrous array and depth of synthesizers. In old-fashioned days, you had to put in plugs, and they had cards like telephone operators had to plug in, and they called this thing Tonto. That was the name of it. And Stevie just did some of the most miraculous things, and then from there on in, you know, the synthesizer became another child that was a part of the vocabulary.
In the 70s, the artist had the opportunity to take the time in the studio to spend the time that he deemed necessary to really, really do his or her art, whether it was self-indulgent or not. I mean, Steely Dan used to take me 6 weeks just to find a comfortable chair at $300 an hour. You know, it was pretty silly.
The biggest problem with recording studios is the surfeit of options. There are far too many things.
Can I just hear the new Mellotron sound, please? That wasn't really quite exaggerated enough.
There's always an oscillation of attraction between going the whole hog with studio technology which always goes over the top at some point. You know, the music of the early 70s was actually fairly tedious as a result of people suddenly becoming possessed by the idea that they were symphonic composers.
What do you know, and I found that was the most interesting aspect of the new music that we were doing at that time was actually working with synthesizers but throwing the manuals away so that we had no idea how the damn things worked. And it was the mistakes that they made that we found more interesting than the stuff that they were supposed... Because these things are programmed by high-tech buffs who really don't have any sensibility of what can be done musically, so they put in the stuff that they believe musicians would want to use. And that's the stuff that you really don't want to hear because it's like fake strings and things like that. So if you get the wrong circuits going, you get all these crackles and farts coming out of these things. I mean, it just produces the most extraordinary sounds and different range of textures.
There is music that is sacred to us, and that's what's caused this attitude in the studio. You know, an album like Sgt. Pepper, well, everyone thinks they have a Sgt. Pepper in them somewhere, you know. But if there is a Sgt. Pepper of the 70s, you'd have to say that Dark Side of the Moon was it.
We were thinking in the 70s, as we do today, of making great records, which means an album to me. I mean, singles seem like part of a different business. We all believed in or were aiming for the same thing, which is perfection, you know, of every piece of music being magical and uplifting and wonderful, and the lyrics doing whatever particular job they were doing to that same extent. So, you know, we were working towards a common goal.
Run back and drop in a bit?
Yeah, you can if you like. Just turn it down a bit. Dark Side of the Moon was done at Abbey Road Studios. At some point during the proceedings, I don't remember exactly when it was, Roger came up with the idea of making it a piece about madness and all the other things that it's about. I think that I sort of tend to bring musicality and melodies and all that sort of stuff. Roger was certainly a very good motivator and obviously a great lyricist. Roger was much more ruthless about musical ideas, where he'd be very happy to lose something if it was for the greater good of making the sense of the whole album work. So, you know, Roger would be happy to sort of make a lovely sounding piece of music disappear into sort of radio sound or something, and sound really awful if it was benefiting the whole piece.
Can I put this down?
He wanted to use, you know, the ideas from the songs to get responses from people, and we wrote out a series of questions and got people into the studio, and we interviewed roadies and Jerry, the Irish doorman at Abbey Road. A question like, when did you last hit someone? And then the next question would be, were you in the right? And would you do it again if the same thing happened? And question like, what does the Dark Side of the Moon mean to you? Of course, understanding that the Dark Side of the Moon was not yet the title of the album, or not as far as anyone was concerned. So they were actually asking people, what does the other side of the moon mean to you? And which is why Jerry, the Irish doorman, said there is no dark side of the moon, really, it's all dark. Stuff like that, which when you put it into a context on the record, suddenly develops its own much more sort of powerful meaning. For me, rock and roll just means that there aren't any rules, and it's just whatever you want to do, however you want to do it. People say it sounds so professional and so slick. I'd have to argue with that even today. I wouldn't say that my technique or some of the others' techniques were particularly in the brilliant era. If you're talking about technique, we were really crap when we started. I mean, we really were pretty chronic. We didn't have any technique at all. Like I say, it should be anything you want it to be, rock and roll. If it's moving any people in any way at all, then it's doing its job, I guess.
You raise the blade, you make the change, you rearrange me till I'm sane.
In the 70s, I don't know if you can pinpoint it exactly what was happening, but I think a lot of influences were coming together and they were becoming refined. And a lot of the groups you would find would spend months doing a record, which was at that time unusual. And Queen certainly brought in I think unconscious influences.